The rain had been falling all afternoon over the city, the kind of thin, persistent drizzle that made everything look older than it was, the sidewalks darker, the storefronts dimmer, the faces of people hurrying past the glass windows of Greystone Coffee, more drawn and colorless than usual. It was the kind of weather that made a warm, well-lit room feel like a privilege. And Greystone Coffee was exactly that kind of room-polished marble countertops, soft amber lighting, suspended from wrought iron fixtures, the low hum of a jazz record layered beneath murmured conversations, and the gentle percussion of espresso machines. The kind of place where the coffee cost $12 and the silence cost nothing, because everyone inside already understood the price of being there. It was 3:47 in the afternoon when the door opened and a man walked in. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 30s, with dark skin, and the kind of face that had been worn into something quietly dignified by years that hadn't always been kind. He wore a dark jacket, not the expensive kind, not the kind anyone in that room would have glanced at twice with admiration. The collar slightly frayed at the edges, the fabric faded near the shoulders. His jeans were plain, his boots were older than most of the handbags in the room. He moved without hurry, without apology, without the slight self-consciousness that most people carried into a room that was clearly not designed for them. He simply walked to the counter, ordered one black coffee, paid with cash, and took a seat in the far corner of the room, the table near the window, back to the wall, facing the door. His name was Marcus Hale, and he was 41 years old, though most people who looked at him that afternoon thought he was either younger or older, depending on the angle, depending on the light. What none of them thought, what none of them could have guessed, was anything close to the truth. Marcus set his coffee down, wrapped both hands around the paper cup, and looked out at the rain. On his left hand, visible to anyone who cared to notice, was a wedding ring. Plain gold, worn smooth, not polished, not new. The kind of ring that had lived on a finger for years without ever being removed. Across the room, in a curved leather booth near the fireplace, 4 people in expensive suits were finishing a meeting. 3 men, 1 woman. The woman was the one at the center of it, not geographically, but in the way the conversation oriented itself around her. Her name was Diana Mercer, 36 years old, founder and chief executive of a mid-sized cybersecurity firm called Mercer Solutions that had, over the past 4 years, become something that the right people in the right rooms talked about with a particular kind of respect. She had dark hair pulled back cleanly, a charcoal blazer, and the posture of someone who had spent years learning that the room would not give her authority unless she already carried it when she walked in. She was closing a Series B funding round. The men across from her were investors. The meeting had been going well. Then one of the men, the one with the silver watch and the haircut that cost more than Marcus's entire outfit, leaned slightly sideways and said something under his breath to the man beside him, and both of them looked toward the corner where Marcus sat. One of them smiled. It started quietly, the way most cruelties do. A comment passed between 2 people who assumed no one outside their orbit could matter enough to hear it. The man with the silver watch said, without particular effort to lower his voice, that the man in the corner looked like he'd been sleeping in his car. The other man replied that whoever let him in clearly had no standards. A woman at the adjacent table, someone who had arrived with them, some associate or client, laughed once, short and bright, and then pressed her fingers to her lips, as if the laugh had surprised even her. One of the investors looked Marcus over and said, loud enough that 2 nearby tables could hear, that the ring on his hand and the look on his face told the whole story, a man whose wife had either left him or died, and who clearly hadn't managed to put himself back together since. The word they used was failure, not whispered, not entirely. Diana Mercer heard it. She did not laugh. She also did not speak. She set her pen down on the table and looked at Marcus for a moment, not with pity, not with the particular brand of liberal guilt that would have made her feel better about herself, but with something more neutral and more careful. Observation. The way you look at something you don't yet understand. Marcus did not look back. He raised his coffee to his lips, took one slow sip, and returned his gaze to the window. His expression did not change. His jaw did not tighten. There was no visible reaction at all, and that absolute absence of reaction was the first thing Diana Mercer filed away without quite knowing why. What the investors could not see, because they were not looking at the right things, was that Marcus Hale had not once stopped watching the room. His eyes moved slowly, methodically, in a pattern that was so practiced it had become invisible, the way breathing is invisible, the way balance is invisible. The mechanics of survival internalized so completely, they no longer looked like mechanics at all. He had noted the position of every person in the room within 40 seconds of entering. He had identified the two exits, the front door and the service corridor beside the counter. He knew which of the tables near the windows were closest to the street. He knew the angles. He always knew the angles. It was not paranoia. It had never been paranoia. It was training so deep it had become reflex, and reflex so old it had become instinct, and instinct so ingrained it no longer had a name. He sat with his back to the wall, not because he was nervous, but because he had not sat any other way in nearly 15 years. He watched the door not because he expected anything, but because his body had stopped knowing how to stop watching. These were the kinds of habits that did not leave a man. These were the kinds of habits that were installed by years and circumstance and loss so total it rewired the architecture of who you were. 20 minutes into his coffee, a young server named Beth, 19, working her second week at Greystone, came too quickly around the corner of the counter with a full tray. Her foot caught the edge of a floor mat. The tray tilted. 3 cups of coffee and a glass of cold water began to slide toward the floor in the specific, irreversible way that breakable things fall when no one is close enough to catch them. Marcus caught the glass before it left the tray. His hand moved in a single, clean arc. No lurch, no scramble, no performance, just one arm, extending from where he sat, fingers closing around the glass at the exact moment before gravity finished its claim, and then his hand returning to the table as if he had simply reached for his own cup. Beth stood there for a moment, wide-eyed, tray still tilting, now stabilized by Marcus's other hand, which had appeared beneath it without anyone quite seeing the movement. He gave her a small nod. She stammered a thank you. He released the tray, returned to his coffee. The whole exchange had taken perhaps 3 seconds. 2 tables nearby had seen it. One of the investors had not. Diana Mercer had. She watched him for a moment longer than the incident required. There was something about the speed. Not impressive fast, not showy fast, but the specific, economical speed of someone who had spent years training the gap between seeing and acting to be as small as humanly possible. She picked up her pen and pretended to look at her notes. The 3 men came in at 4:17. The door of Greystone Coffee opened hard, harder than the weather required, harder than any ordinary customer pushed a door, and they were inside before the bell above the frame had finished its single chime. They wore dark clothes, hoods up, faces partly covered. The first one through was the biggest, broad and heavy, moving like someone who had learned that his size was the first argument. He had a handgun held low and close to his body, visible only to the people nearest the door. The second was lean, faster on his feet, already moving sideways to cover the room from a different angle before most people had processed that anything was wrong. The third positioned himself near the counter. For approximately 2 seconds, the cafe existed in that suspended, crystalline moment of collective comprehension, the moment before the screaming, before the understanding arrived, fully formed and unbearable. And then the first man raised his weapon and said, "Do not move. Do not speak. Put your phones on the table." And the room broke, not all at once, in pieces. A woman near the window stood up instinctively and was told to sit back down in language that required no translation. An older man at the counter pressed himself against the wall. One of the investors went very pale and placed both hands flat on the table in front of him, as if the table were the only solid thing left. Diana Mercer did not move. She sat very still and watched the men move through the room with the specific quality of attention she gave to problems she was trying to solve. The lean one, the second man, moved through the tables with a pillowcase, collecting phones and wallets and watches with the practiced, unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this before. The big one stayed near the door. The third held the counter. It was functional, organized, and terrifying in the way that organized violence is always more terrifying than chaotic violence. Because the organization implies planning, and planning implies people who decided in advance that this was acceptable. Marcus Hale sat in his corner with his coffee cup between his palms and watched them. His breathing did not change. His posture did not change. His eyes, which had been moving slowly around the room since the moment they walked in, were now perfectly still fixed. Not on any single man, but on all three simultaneously, in the way that certain kinds of training teaches you to hold a field of vision without narrowing it. He was calculating. Not consciously, not with language or sequence. The calculation happened below thought. In the animal-fast architecture of a brain, trained to process violence the way musicians process rhythm. Distances, position, the angle of each weapon, the weight of each man, the order in which the variables had to be resolved. The lean man reached the corner table. He looked down at Marcus, at the worn jacket, at the cheap boots, at the ring on the left hand, and seemed to make an immediate and dismissive assessment. He kicked Marcus's foot. Hard. "Look up," he said. Marcus looked up, and the man who looked back at him from behind Marcus Hale's eyes was not the man who had walked into Greystone Coffee that afternoon. The face was the same, the jacket was the same, but something had shifted behind the eyes. Something had come forward that had been waiting in the back of a very dark room for a very long time, and the lean man had just enough time to register that the face looking up at him was wrong somehow, wrong in a way he could not name, before the world moved very quickly. 2 seconds. That is the honest accounting of what followed. Not a minute. Not a dramatic, choreographed sequence that played out with the measured clarity of a film. 2 seconds of violence so precise and so total that most of the people in the room did not fully understand what they had witnessed until it was already finished. Marcus's left hand took the lean man's gun wrist. Not grab took, in the specific sense of a hand closing around a joint with enough force and leverage that the joint becomes the weakest point in any equation. His right hand came across and struck the inside of the elbow, a single, hard blow to the bundle of nerves that controls grip, and the weapon dropped. His right hand caught it before it reached the floor, and in the same motion his left elbow came up and across, in an arc that ended at the bridge of the lean man's nose, with a sound like a branch breaking. The lean man went down. The big man near the door had registered the motion by the time Marcus was already turning registered it, and begun to raise his weapon, which he had been holding low and careless, because nothing in the room had suggested he would need it to be otherwise. And Marcus crossed the distance between them in 3 steps that were closer to a controlled fall than a run. Low and fast, inside the angle of the weapon before it reached level, his shoulder driving into the man's sternum, with enough force to take the breath clean out of him. They hit the wall. Marcus stepped back. His knee came up. The big man folded. Marcus caught him by the collar on the way down, and guided him to the floor, with a deliberateness that was almost courteous. The third man, near the counter, fired once. The shot went into the ceiling, a panic shot, the shot of a man who had already decided to run and pulled the trigger because his body was still processing the decision. And then the third man was through the door and into the rain. Marcus looked at the door for exactly 1 second. He did not pursue. He looked at the room. He looked at Diana Mercer, who was standing beside the booth, her chair pushed back, her hands at her sides, her expression entirely unreadable. He looked at Beth behind the counter, who had pressed herself into the corner and was holding her tray against her chest like a shield. He set the recovered weapon carefully on the nearest table, barrel pointing at the wall. He said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Call 911. Then he returned to his seat, picked up his coffee, and waited. The police arrived in 11 minutes. 2 patrol cars first, then a third, then a vehicle that was unmarked but recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for in the way it was parked precise, covering 2 angles, not the parking of a man who was worried about the meter. The officers moved through the cafe taking statements. The 2 men Marcus had put down were conscious, the big one barely, both of them restrained on the floor near the door, with a calm that suggested Marcus had done something specific to ensure they would remain there without further persuasion. A detective was asking Diana Mercer questions. She answered them accurately and completely. She said the man in the corner had disarmed the first attacker in approximately 2 seconds and neutralized the second one within the same span. The detective looked at his notepad, then at the men on the floor, then back at Diana with the expression of a person revising a category. He asked her to describe the movements. She said she would try, but that the honest answer was she had not been able to see most of them clearly enough to describe. It had happened too fast. Not fast like someone in a hurry. Fast like something that does not need to hurry because it has already arrived before the other thing understood it was moving. Among the officers who came through the door that night, there was one who was older than the rest. A sergeant, gray at the temples, the kind of career law enforcement face that had absorbed a great deal and given very little of it back. He walked through the room doing what the sergeant does when the room is already controlled, which is understand what happened well enough to explain it to people who were not there. He came to the corner where Marcus sat. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then he straightened, in a way that was subtle and entirely involuntary, the kind of straightening that happens when a body recognizes something the mind has not yet consciously processed. He said, "Sir," not officer to civilian, not detective to witness, "Sir," with the specific weight the word carries when it passes between people who have been places most people have not been. Marcus looked at him. He gave the small, acknowledging nod of a man who understood the language and preferred to keep the conversation brief. The sergeant moved on. Diana watched this exchange from across the room. She had been watching Marcus since the moment the police arrived, watching him give his statement in a voice so low and measured the detective had to lean in twice, watching him decline to answer 3 separate reporters who materialized outside the window with phones raised, watching him thank no one, accept nothing, draw no attention to himself in any way that was not strictly required by the situation. By the time she looked away, the cafe had begun to empty. By the time she looked back, Marcus Hale was gone. She thought about him for 3 days before she did anything about it. This was unusual for Diana Mercer, who was not accustomed to hesitating. She had built her company on the principle that the distance between a decision and its execution should be as short as possible, that hesitation was the tax paid by people who were uncertain, and that certainty was a skill that could be developed by anyone willing to do the work. But she hesitated about Marcus Hale, and she understood the hesitation well enough to know it was not uncertainty about whether to look. It was uncertainty about what she would find. She hired a private investigator on the 4th day. She did not use the company's resources. She used a firm she had worked with before, run by a former federal agent named Gabe Torres, who knew how to be discreet and how to interpret the difference between what records showed and what records meant. Gabe called her 6 days later. He had found almost nothing. This was, he told her, itself a finding. Most people leave traces without trying. A rental history, a tax record, a name on a utility account, a photograph tagged somewhere by someone who knew them. Marcus Hale had, it appeared, excised himself from the documentary residue of modern life with the kind of thoroughness that was not accidental. There was no presence online, no registered property, no vehicle in his name. The address he had given police was a rented room above a dry cleaning shop in a neighborhood that asked no questions and got no attention. He paid cash. He had no listed next of kin. What Gabe had found, through a contact who worked with certain military records that were technically accessible through channels that were technically legal, was a photograph. A single, dated, physical photograph that had been scanned and filed as part of a personnel record that was itself mostly redacted. In the photograph, a younger version of Marcus Hale stood with 4 other men in front of a vehicle Diana did not recognize. They were in desert terrain. They were wearing operational gear, the kind worn by people whose job was to go to places that did not appear on news reports. The unit designation below the photograph had been blacked out, not redacted in the digital sense, physically blacked out, over the original, in ink, by someone who had done it deliberately and with conviction. Gabe's contact, a retired special operations officer named Vincent, had looked at the photograph, and then at Gabe, and said exactly one thing. If the woman who hired you knew what that man did for this country, she would stop asking questions and start being grateful she was still alive to ask them. Then, he had walked away and not answered his phone for the rest of the day. Diana sat with this information for a long time. She thought about the man in the corner of Greystone Coffee and the way he had watched the door. She thought about the wedding ring. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the room after the men were on the floor, not with pride, not with the look of someone waiting to be acknowledged, but with a brief, scanning assessment, the kind of look that was asking a question rather than presenting an answer. She thought about the word the investors had used, failure, and she thought about how completely, how catastrophically wrong they had been, and how little Marcus Hale had done to correct them, and what it said about a person that they would accept that word without reaching for a single syllable of defense. She saw him 11 days after Greystone. She did not plan it, or rather, she told herself she did not plan it, while choosing to return to the cafe at the same time on the same afternoon, and sitting at a table near the window, and ordering a black coffee she did not particularly want. Marcus was there. Same corner, same table, same paper cup in both hands, same gaze, directed at the rain-blurred window, same ring on the left hand, turning slowly in the light. Diana took her coffee to his table. She asked if she could sit. He looked at her for a moment with the particular economy of expression that characterized everything he did, and then he indicated the chair across from him with one hand, and she sat. She told him her name. He told her his. They did not talk about Greystone. They did not talk about the photograph, or the redacted record, or the single sentence from a man who had then declined to answer his phone. They talked, instead, about the rain, about the neighborhood, about the coffee, which Marcus acknowledged was better than it had any right to be at this price. Diana laughed, once, silent, and noticed that the sound seemed to catch Marcus slightly off guard, not in a bad way, but in the way of a not heard. She had decided that before she sat down, some doors you do not open from the outside. You wait, and you let the person inside decide if they want to open it, and if they do not, you accept that as its own kind of answer. They sat for 40 minutes. When Diana stood to leave, Marcus stood too, not because he was leaving, but because the instinct was older than the context. She extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was brief, measured, controlled in the way that told her this was a man who knew exactly how much force was in his hands and was careful, always careful, about how much he used. She was aware that someone was following her on the 14th day after Greystone. She was aware of it the way most people are, aware of a noise in a house at night, a marginal thing, a peripheral thing, something the body registered before the brain caught up. She mentioned it to no one. She changed her route home twice, and noted that the change made no difference to the feeling. On the 17th day, she found a note slipped under the door of her office, not the building's front door, the actual door of her specific office on the 14th floor, which should have been inaccessible without a key card and 3 separate security checkpoints. The note said, in block letters, on a plain index card, "Take different routes. Vary your schedule." What it did not say was who had written it. What it did not say was how it had arrived at her door. What she understood, sitting at her desk at 7 in the morning with the note in her hand and the city beginning its noise below her window, was that someone was watching her, and that someone else was already watching the person watching her, and that the second someone was the reason the first someone had not yet acted. She did not call the police. She called Gabe Torres, who told her the note was consistent with protective surveillance methodology, and that if she had a guardian angel, she would do well not to spook it. She did not see Marcus for 6 days after the note, but she felt, in the specific way of a person whose nervous system has been sharpened by months of building a company in a hostile market, that she was not alone when she walked to her car, that the figure she half saw near the parking structure entrance on Tuesday was not random, that the blue sedan which appeared in her peripheral vision on 3 separate routes home over 4 days was not coincidental. On the 23rd day, a man tried to follow her from a restaurant where she had dinner with her CFO. He was professional about it. Not aggressive, not obvious. But Diana had been paying attention in the way that people learn to pay attention when their nervous system is trying to tell them something. She walked 2 blocks, turned a corner, and stopped. She heard footsteps slow and then stop behind the corner. She stood very still. Then, from the opposite end of the block, a figure moved quiet, fast, without ceremony. And she heard, but did not see, what happened next. A brief physical exchange. One short, compressed sound of impact. Then silence. Marcus Hale appeared from around the corner. He looked at her. He said simply, "Go home." She went home. She sat in her apartment for a long time with all the lights on. The night they came for her was a Thursday. She had worked late, later than usual, later than was wise given everything she had begun to understand about her situation, and she was in the parking structure below her building alone when they came. 3 men. Not the same 3 from Greystone, but organized in the same functional arrangement, and working for the same structure that had produced the men at Greystone, which was a criminal organization with significant resources and a particular investment in the principle that people who interfered with their operations should face consequences they could not anticipate. They moved quickly and efficiently, and Diana did not have time to do anything except register that they were there before something closed around her arm. She was moved through a service exit, into a vehicle, and driven for what she estimated was 30 minutes, though her sense of time had compressed into the specific, unreliable format of fear. The building she was taken to was a warehouse in a light industrial zone south of the city. Concrete floors, high ceilings, the smell of old machinery, and standing water. She was placed in a room that had been partitioned from the main space by industrial shelving. There were 4 men in the building that she could hear, possibly more that she could not. Her hands were zip-tied in front of her, which she knew from a security briefing she had attended 2 years ago was better than behind, though this knowledge was not particularly comforting in the present moment. They told her someone would call her firm in the morning, that the number they would request was $1.5 million, that this was, in their assessment, a reasonable number for someone in her position, and that she should cooperate, and this would end cleanly. She did not reply. She was thinking about Angles. She heard him before she saw him. Or rather, she heard what his arrival produced in the men outside the partition. A brief, sharp exclamation, then a sound she did not immediately identify, then another, then silence, then a different sound, lower and more final, then nothing. The door of the partition opened. Marcus Hale stood in the frame. He was wearing the same jacket. His hands were empty. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried to a dark line against his skin. He looked at her. He assessed her physically, the way a medic looks at a patient, fast and systematic. And then he crossed the room in 4 steps and cut the zip tie with a folding knife that appeared and disappeared so quickly it seemed almost not to have existed. He said, "Can you walk?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then we go now." They went. He moved through the building the way water moves through a structure following lines of least resistance, constantly aware of the shape of the space, positioning himself between Diana and every door and every shadow and every angle that might produce a problem. There was one more man outside, near the vehicle they had arrived in. Marcus handled this, without breaking stride in a way that was so quick and so contained that Diana's brain, which was fully engaged in the work of surviving, did not have enough spare capacity to process it until they were already past and moving toward the street. They walked 4 blocks in the rain before Marcus stopped at a car that Diana did not recognize and opened the passenger door and told her to get in. She got in. He drove. He did not say anything for 6 minutes. Then he asked if she was hurt. She said no. He nodded. She looked at the cut above his eye and said, "You're bleeding." He said, "I know." She said, "You went in alone." He said nothing. She said, "Why did you go in alone?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, without looking at her, "Because the people I used to go in with are not here anymore." And there was something in the way he said it, the specific, horizontal quality of grief, in a voice from which most of its expression has been carefully removed that made Diana Mercer press her lips together and look out the window at the rain and not say anything else for a very long time. 3 weeks after the warehouse, a retired Army general named Harold Whitmore came to Diana's office. He was 72 years old, straight-backed, in civilian clothes that he wore, with the residual posture of decades in uniform. He had called ahead and used a name that Gabe Torres had given Diana as a contact 2 degrees removed from the redacted photograph. He sat across from her desk and folded his hands and told her, in the measured cadence of someone who had delivered important information to civilians many times and knew how to pace it for comprehension, what she had been trying to understand about Marcus Hale. He told her the unit designation that had been blacked out in the photograph. He told her the number of deployments. He described, in broad and careful terms that omitted specifics he was still not authorized to share, the nature of the operations Marcus had been part of the kind of work, conducted by a very small number of people, in very specific places, for very specific purposes, the kind of work that required a person to be willing to do things that could not be explained to a congressional committee or reported in any newspaper, and to do those things with the precision and the self-control and the absolute, trained suppression of self-preservation instinct that most human beings simply did not possess. He told her that Marcus had been recommended for commendations he had declined, that he had been offered positions administrative, instructional, positions that would have come with office doors and titles, and the institutionalized respect of a system that knew exactly what he had done, and that he had declined those too. He told her about the mission. He did not use the word terrorist. He said, an attack on a diplomatic vehicle. He said, there were 3 people in that vehicle. He said, only one of them survived. He paused. He looked at his hands. He said, her name was Claire. They had been married for 7 years. The general said she had been a translator attached to the diplomatic mission, that she had not been supposed to be in that vehicle, that it was the kind of operational detail that changes everything and changes nothing, because the outcome is the same regardless of what was supposed to happen. He said that Marcus had been on a separate element of the same mission, that he had received the call, that he had arrived at the scene of the attack in time to understand everything that had happened and to do nothing about any of it. He said that Marcus had submitted his separation papers 3 weeks after the memorial service, and that they had been accepted because there was nothing anyone could say to a man in that condition that would change a decision that was not actually a decision, it was a verdict. He said, he has not spoken to anyone at the unit since. He said, some of the men check on him. He says he is fine. He said this last sentence with the specific, exhausted honesty of a man who knew exactly what fine meant when it came from someone like Marcus Hale, and what it cost. Diana sat with this for a long time after the general left. She sat in her office with the city, visible through the window, and the rain finally gone, and the late afternoon sky doing something complicated and beautiful, with the light that she did not have words for. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the ring. She thought about a man who had spent his career going into buildings where the outcome was uncertain and coming back out again, until one day the person he was coming back for was not there anymore. She thought about the corner table at Greystone Coffee, and the careful distance between where Marcus sat and where anyone else might try to reach him, and the way he had watched the door, not with fear, but with the habit of a man who had made his peace with the fact that the door was where things came from. She thought about 2 seconds, the terrible, precise efficiency of 2 seconds, and she understood that what she had seen at Greystone was not performance. It was not a demonstration of anything. It was simply what happens when a person has spent enough years practicing the protection of other people that it becomes the truest and most automatic expression of who they are so deep it operates below choice, below heroism, below any concept that requires an audience or a narrative. It simply happens because it is what he is, and it will keep happening as long as there are people near him who need protecting, and he will not consider it remarkable, and he will not wait to be thanked. She went to find him. She knew he was at Greystone before she arrived. She had begun, over the past weeks, to develop a tentative theory of his patterns, the way you develop a theory of anything by paying careful attention for long enough. He was in the corner, same table. She walked to him without hesitation and sat down across from him and told him she knew. Not all of it. Enough of it. She told him about the general's visit. She told him she was not asking him to explain himself or justify anything or produce a version of his history that was easier for her to hold. She said, "I'm telling you because I think you're used to carrying things alone that don't have to be carried alone, and because I think that's a habit you learned somewhere that made sense at the time and might not anymore." Marcus looked at her for a long time. The kind of look that is not defensive or warm but is entirely open, a person deciding whether to let something in. He said, "What do you want, Diana?" She said, "I want to offer you something." He said, "I don't need a job." She said, "I know. I'm not offering you a job." Not exactly. He said nothing. She said, "I'm offering you a reason." He said, "A reason for what?" She said, "To stop sitting in the corner of this cafe every afternoon watching the door as though you're waiting for something bad to happen." He said, "Something bad does happen." She almost smiled. She said, "I know. I've seen your work." He looked at her. After a moment, something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the faintest change in the set of his expression, the most subtle relaxation of something that had been held in tension for years. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside the window, the city moved on in the specific way of cities, which is to say, indifferent to everything except its own continuous motion. They did not fall in love quickly. Marcus Hale was not a person capable of doing anything quickly that involved the opening of himself to another person. This was not a flaw. It was the honest consequence of what his history had constructed him into, and Diana understood this with the particular intelligence of someone who had built her own defenses and knew what they were made of. What they did, instead, was spend time in each other's company in ways that were low pressure and consistent. Coffee, sometimes lunch, once, a long walk through a park in early winter while Marcus told her, unprompted, about the way desert terrain looks at 4 in the morning under night vision, not the content of any mission, just the quality of the light and the particular silence of a landscape that has no expectations of you. Diana told him about her firm's early days, about the investor who had told her, very politely, that the market she was targeting didn't need a company like hers, and what she had done with that information. Marcus listened in the way he did everything, with complete, undivided attention, the kind of attention that made you feel that what you were saying was the only sound in the world, which was disconcerting at first and then, gradually, became something she looked forward to. He cooked for her once, in the rented room above the dry cleaning shop, a simple meal that he made with the focused, unhurried competence of a man who had learned to do everything with focused, unhurried competence, and she sat at his small table and ate it, and understood that this was a man who had not had anyone to cook for in a long time, and that the act of it meant something that neither of them needed to translate into language. The ring came off on a Sunday, in February, almost 5 months after Greystone Coffee. He did not make an announcement. Diana arrived for coffee, and he was sitting in the corner with both hands around his cup, and the left hand was bare and slightly pale where the ring had been, the skin lighter in a narrow band that told the exact story without a word being required. He looked at her when she sat down. She did not look at his hand. She said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning." They ordered coffee. After a moment he said, "I put it in a box." "I'm not." He stopped, started again. "It was the longest thing Claire could have wanted for me. It took me a while to understand that," Diana said quietly. "I think she would have agreed." He nodded. They were both quiet for a while, the comfortable quiet of two people who have decided that the space between them does not need to be filled. Outside, the February light was thin and pale and doing its best. The day they returned to Greystone together, it was October. A year had passed, very nearly, since the afternoon of the rain and the worn jacket and the $12 coffee and the men who said failure without knowing they were pointing at the most accomplished person in the room. The cafe looked the same. The amber lights, the marble counter, the jazz playing low and soft. Marcus and Diana came through the door together, The kind of together that requires no annotation because it is visible in the way two people share a threshold, in the half-second calibration of pace that happens between people who have moved through space with each other long enough that the adjustments are automatic. The manager of Greystone, a man in his 50s named Patrick, who had been behind the counter on the afternoon of the robbery and had dropped his coffee cup when the first man came through the door, recognized Marcus immediately. He came around the counter. He stood in front of Marcus and Diana, and he said quietly, "I owe you something." Marcus shook his head. Patrick said, "The day it happened, I'm sorry for what was said before. By the people at that table." Marcus looked at him for a moment. He said, "You didn't say it." Patrick said, "I heard it. I didn't say anything." Marcus was quiet. He said, "Neither did I." This seemed to be, for Marcus, the entire point of the story, that silence in the face of cruelty is its own choice, and that he had made the same choice that day as everyone else in the room, and that this put them all in the same category, which was human, which was imperfect, which was still redeemable. Patrick looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Your coffee is on the house. Every time. Both of you," Marcus said, with the smallest and most genuine of smiles. "You don't have to," Patrick said. "I know." Diana had been listening to this exchange, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes moving between the two men. She felt something move through her that was not quite sadness and not quite pride. Something older than both, the specific weight of a story arriving at its right moment and laying itself down. She looked at Marcus. He looked back. He said, to the room in general, to no one in particular, to the principle of the thing, "Don't judge a man by his jacket." Patrick laughed. It was the right laugh, at the right moment, in the right room. They took a table near the window, not the corner table, not the position with the maximum sight lines and the wall at the back. The window table, where the light came in and you could see the street and be seen from the street in return, which is the arrangement of a person who has decided that the world does not need to be held at maximum distance anymore. Marcus sat with his back almost to the door. Diana noticed this and said nothing. He noticed her noticing and said nothing. It was enough. Outside, October did what October does in this city. It brought the rain back, light and quiet, the kind of rain that does not demand anything from you, that simply falls and makes the city cleaner and darker and quieter than it was an hour before. Through the window of Greystone Coffee, the two of them were visible to anyone who cared to look, a woman in a charcoal blazer and a man in a jacket that was still, and would probably always be, a little worn at the collar, both of them holding paper cups and talking in the specific, unhurried way of people who have time, who have decided to have time, who have chosen each other as the reason time is worth having. Marcus Hale had spent 15 years being a person that the world relied on without knowing it. He had moved through the highest stakes, lowest profile corners of human experience, and come back changed in ways that had no civilian vocabulary. He had loved someone and lost her in the exact specific way that undoes a person, suddenly, irreversibly, in the gap between one breath and the next, and he had not fallen apart because falling apart was not in his training. He had simply contracted slowly and completely into a smaller and smaller version of the space he occupied, until the space was the size of a corner table in a cafe with his back to the wall. And then something had come through the door. Not the three men with weapons, though they had come too. Something else. The particular, insistent attention of a person who looked at him, not at what he could do, not at the operational record that most people would never know, not at the tragedy of the ring, or the shabby jacket, or the easy story of the man who had clearly failed at ordinary life, but at him, the actual him, the thing underneath all the layers that history and loss had installed. It is the oldest kind of courage, the kind that does not require a weapon or a target, to the courage of deciding to be known again, after a long time of being hidden. Marcus Hale had survived things that most people could not imagine. He had, in the end, found it harder to survive the ordinary vulnerability of letting another person sit down across from him and stay. But he had done it. He had learned it. The way he had learned everything else that mattered slowly, deliberately, with the full weight of his attention. And in the end, this was the only story worth telling about him. Not the 2 seconds, not the redacted record, not the operations that would never appear in any newspaper. The story worth telling was the one that ended with a man choosing, quietly and without announcement, to come back. Courage does not ask to be witnessed. The strongest people are always the quietest ones.